The water was calm at 4:47 in the morning. That's what made it so terrifying. No warning, no diplomatic posturing the night before, no last-minute back-channel calls between Washington and Beijing. Just silence, and then, without any declaration, without any announcement, without a single word transmitted to the international community, the People's Liberation Army Navy moved 3 Type 055 destroyers, 2 Type 052D guided missile cruisers, and a fleet of Coast Guard vessels into a tight formation surrounding Scarborough Shoal, and, in the space of a single pre-dawn hour, erected what defense analysts are now calling a permanent maritime barrier structure directly across one of the most contested shipping arteries on the face of the earth. This is where everything changes. Not because China moved ships. China has been moving ships in the South China Sea for years, but because this time, for the first time, Beijing did something that crossed a line that even its most measured critics had privately hoped it never would. It blocked a Philippine resupply mission to a legally recognized Filipino outpost, fired water cannons at a civilian vessel carrying journalists and humanitarian aid, and when the international community began to respond, it did something almost no one predicted. It stayed. It did not retreat. It did not offer a statement. It simply remained, and in remaining, dared the world to do something about it. To understand why this moment is categorically different from every previous South China Sea confrontation, you have to understand the geography and the economics at the same time, because they are inseparable. The South China Sea is not simply a body of water. According to the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, somewhere between $3 and $5 trillion in global trade passes through this region every single year. More than 60% of the world's liquefied natural gas shipments move through these waters. South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia. Every single one of these economies depends on the freedom of navigation through this corridor in ways that are not theoretical. They are existential. And now, in the early hours of May 3rd, 2026, Beijing had placed a physical structure, not just a naval presence, not just a patrol, but a physical, semi-permanent maritime barrier, directly across a route that the international community has treated as open international water since the UN Permanent Court of Arbitration ruled definitively against China's 9-line claim back in 2016. Beijing rejected that ruling then. It is rejecting it now, not with words, but with steel and concrete and water cannons and the silent, immovable weight of military projection. What happened next shocked even the most seasoned observers in Washington, Tokyo, and Canberra. Within 6 hours of the initial reports reaching Western intelligence services, the United States Pacific Fleet issued a statement that used language it has never used before in relation to a Chinese maritime action. It did not call the move provocative. It did not express concern. It called it, and these words were chosen deliberately, a fundamental violation of the established international rules-based order that the United States and its allies are prepared to defend by all means necessary and available. That phrase, all means necessary and available, does not appear in standard diplomatic language by accident. It is chosen. It is calibrated. And according to 3 separate sources cited by Reuters within hours of the statement's release, the USS George Washington Carrier Strike Group, which had been conducting what the Pentagon described as routine exercises in the Philippine Sea, had already altered its course. But that's not even the most dangerous part. Because while the world's attention was fixed on the water cannons and the blocked resupply ship and the photographs of Filipino sailors being soaked and shoved back from a rusting outpost that their country has maintained since 1999, something else was happening simultaneously, quietly, in a different kind of theater. At the exact same time that Chinese Coast Guard vessels were establishing their new barrier formation, Beijing's foreign ministry convened an emergency briefing and said something that no Chinese official had ever said on the public record before. A spokesperson, standing at the familiar blue podium, stated flatly that the South China Sea has always been and will always be Chinese territorial water, and that any foreign military presence within the 9-line perimeter without explicit Chinese authorization would henceforth be considered an act of provocation, subject to a proportional response. The 9-line, not a modified claim, not a nuanced position. The 9-line, the same claim that an international tribunal declared illegal a decade ago, reasserted loudly in front of cameras as if the ruling had never happened. Defense analysts immediately flagged this as a strategic escalation of a different order. The physical barrier was a provocation. The public reassertion of the 9-line was a doctrine. And doctrines, once stated publicly, are extraordinarily difficult to walk back. IMF estimates suggest that any prolonged disruption to South China Sea shipping lanes would shave between 1, 5, and 2, 3% off regional GDP within a single quarter, a number that sounds abstract until you realize it translates to hundreds of billions of dollars and millions of jobs across some of the most economically dynamic societies on Earth. Vietnam's export-driven economy, Taiwan's semiconductor supply chains, South Korea's shipbuilding and petrochemical industries, Japan's energy imports. All of them thread through this water. All of them are now looking at a map and recalculating. The Philippine government's response came within the hour, and it was not what Beijing expected. President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., who has spent much of his presidency carefully threading the needle between Washington and Beijing, appeared in front of cameras without his usual diplomatic restraint and said something unambiguous. He said that the Philippines would not yield a single square inch of its territorial waters, that the actions of the Chinese Coast Guard were illegal under international law, and that the Philippines had already activated the provisions of the 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty with the United States. That treaty, which had spent years in a kind of strategic ambiguity, presidents from both countries sometimes reluctant to specify exactly what it obligated them to do in maritime scenarios, was now being invoked publicly, formally, and by name. The Americans heard it. Everyone heard it. Washington's response came in layers, and this is where you have to pay careful attention, because the layers matter. The first layer was the public statement from the Pacific Fleet. The second layer was the carrier strike group's course alteration. The third layer, and this one was reported by the War Zone and later confirmed by 2 Pentagon correspondents, was the quiet activation of pre-positioned assets in Guam and the rapid repositioning of American submarine forces into the Western Pacific. Not announced, not broadcast, but picked up by defense monitors and satellite imagery analysts within 24 hours. The United States was not bluffing. It was moving. But here is where the story gets genuinely complex, because Beijing had clearly anticipated some version of this response. China's move was not impulsive. It was not a miscalculation by a mid-level naval commander. The timing, the scale, the doctrine statement, the simultaneous maneuvering of Coast Guard vessels to provide political cover for what were effectively military operations, this had the fingerprints of planning that goes back months, possibly longer. Defense analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies noted that Beijing has been pre-positioning construction materials and modular barrier components at Mischief Reef since at least late 2025. The structure that appeared overnight did not appear overnight. It had been assembled in pieces, waiting. And the moment that Beijing chose to deploy it, with the American political system still recalibrating after a bruising election cycle, with European attention fragmented between the residual pressures of the Ukraine conflict and the economic turbulence of 2025, with ASEAN member states still divided over how hard to push back against Chinese economic leverage, that moment was chosen deliberately. This is the kind of strategic patience that makes Beijing genuinely dangerous in ways that short-term observers often miss. China's leadership under Xi Jinping has repeatedly demonstrated a willingness to absorb short-term international criticism in exchange for long-term positional gains. The land reclamation in the Spratly Islands, the militarization of artificial islands that China had explicitly promised not to militarize, the steady erosion of Hong Kong's autonomy. Each step met with loud international condemnation. Each step absorbed, each step followed by the next step. And now, in May of 2026, the next step had arrived. It was bigger than the previous ones. It carried a doctrine statement attached to it, and it had been deployed into a strategic environment that Beijing had clearly assessed as favorable for exactly this kind of move. The question that every government in the region was now asking in private was one that no one wanted to answer publicly. Had Beijing just tested the red line, or had it crossed it? Because there is a profound and consequential difference between the two. Testing a red line means you are probing for a response, willing to pull back if the response is sufficiently strong. Crossing a red line means you have made a decision. You have committed. You're no longer probing. You are establishing a new reality and daring others to reverse it. And reversing a new reality is categorically harder than preventing it in the first place. History understands this instinctively. So did the defense ministers in Manila, Tokyo, Canberra, and Seoul, all of whom were, according to multiple reports from Al Jazeera and Bloomberg, on calls with each other and with Washington within hours of the initial incident. Japan's response was particularly significant. Tokyo, which has been quietly but systematically expanding the legal authorities of its self-defense forces under Prime Minister Ishiba's government, issued a statement that went further than any previous Japanese statement on South China Sea matters. It called the Chinese action a direct threat to the freedom of navigation and overflight upon which Japan's security and prosperity depend, and stated that Japan stood in full solidarity with the Philippines under the terms of their newly deepened security partnership. That partnership, formalized in late 2024, includes provisions for Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force participation in joint patrols. And according to a defense official cited by the Japan Times, those provisions were now under active consideration. Japan in the South China Sea. That sentence alone would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. Australia's foreign minister flew to Manila on an emergency basis. South Korea recalled its ambassador from Beijing for consultations. a diplomatic gesture that carries enormous symbolic weight from a country that has historically been among China's most economically entangled neighbors. Vietnam, which shares a long and bitter history with China and a separate set of overlapping South China Sea claims, began moving additional Coast Guard assets toward its own contested maritime territories, a signal that Hanoi was watching the Philippine situation and drawing conclusions about what Chinese assertiveness now meant for its own position. At the exact same time, inside Beijing, something interesting was happening that the outside world could not fully see but could begin to infer. The Chinese economy in the spring of 2026 was not the Chinese economy of 5 years ago. IMF data had revised China's growth forecast downward for the third consecutive quarter. Youth unemployment remained stubbornly high. Despite official statistics that most independent economists treated with skepticism, the real estate sector, which had been in managed distress since the Evergrande collapse years earlier, was still not resolved. It was merely contained, and containment was getting more expensive every month. Consumer confidence had flatlined. Foreign direct investment into China had fallen sharply, driven partly by geopolitical risk recalculation among American, European, and even Southeast Asian companies. The supply chain diversification that had been a business school talking point in 2022 had become operational reality by 2026. Apple, Samsung, and dozens of multinational manufacturers had quietly moved significant production capacity to India, Vietnam, and Mexico. The economic gravity that had once made China almost untouchable as a target of serious international pressure was shifting. This context matters enormously for understanding the South China Sea escalation because aggressive nationalist moves in the maritime domain have historically served a dual purpose in Beijing's domestic calculus. They project strength internationally, but they also project strength domestically to an audience that the Chinese Communist Party cannot afford to lose. The urban middle class that has watched its savings eroded, its job prospects narrowed, and its social mobility compressed by an economic slowdown that official propaganda keeps describing as temporary. There is a theory, advanced by some China analysts and reported with careful sourcing by foreign policy, that the South China Sea escalation was timed partly with this domestic dimension in mind. That the barrier, the doctrine statement, and the confrontation with Manila were designed not just to establish a new maritime reality, but to generate the kind of nationalist energy that Xi's government has repeatedly used as a pressure release valve when economic frustration builds to dangerous levels. If that theory is correct, then the strategy may be working in one direction and backfiring in another, because the international response is coalescing in ways that Beijing's scenario planners may have underestimated. The United States was not retreating. Japan was not retreating. Australia was flying its foreign minister to Manila, and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which had spent years issuing carefully hedged statements that avoided directly naming China, convened an emergency session and issued a communiqué that, for the first time in the bloc's history, specifically identified Chinese actions as a threat to regional peace and stability. It did not name the 9-dash line. It did not call for sanctions, but it named China. And that naming from a body that had built its entire diplomatic culture around not naming China was the kind of signal that Beijing's foreign ministry reads with very close attention. Defense News reported that American and Philippine forces had begun conducting what were described as enhanced freedom of navigation operations within 24 hours of the initial incident. Operations that specifically transited the area of the new barrier structure, sailing within what Beijing had declared its new operational perimeter. The Chinese Navy shadowed these operations. It did not fire. It did not block, but it shadowed. And those shadows, those two fleets moving in close proximity, aware of each other, watching each other, calculating each other, represented the most dangerous moment the South China Sea had seen since the early years of China's artificial island construction campaign. The oil market noticed. Brent crude moved upward by nearly $4 a barrel within the first 12 hours of confirmed reporting on the incident. Shipping insurance premiums for vessels transiting the South China Sea spiked. Lloyd's of London risk assessors, whose professional reflex is understatement, upgraded their assessment of the region from elevated to critical. Several major container shipping lines issued advisories to their captains about route planning in the region. The economic nervous system of the world was reacting to what its sensors were reading as genuine escalation, not theater. And then came the development that nobody had anticipated. Taiwan. The government in Taipei, which had maintained a careful silence in the first 12 hours, watching and calculating, issued a statement that was brief but devastating in its implications. Taiwan's foreign ministry stated that the People's Republic of China's actions in the South China Sea demonstrated a pattern of behavior that was entirely consistent with the threat Taiwan faced, and called on the international community to recognize that the security of Taiwan and the security of the South China Sea were not separate questions, but a single integrated challenge. That statement did several things simultaneously. It linked the Taiwan question directly to the South China Sea escalation in a way that complicated Beijing's framing. It invited the international community to treat both theaters as part of a unified strategic problem. And it reminded the world, at a moment when the world was already watching the South China Sea, that 100 miles across the Taiwan Strait, another situation was simmering. One that, should the South China Sea crisis deepen or create the precedent that aggression goes unchecked, could enter a much more dangerous phase. Beijing's response to Taiwan's statement was immediate and furious. The Chinese Foreign Ministry described it as a grave provocation and issued language about Taiwan that was, by the assessment of multiple seasoned China analysts cited by CNN, notably more threatening in tone than what Beijing typically deploys. The Global Times, which serves as a reliable barometer of the nationalist edge of Chinese official opinion, published an editorial that described the current moment as the beginning of a new era of Chinese maritime sovereignty, and warned that those who stood in the way of China's legitimate territorial rights would bear the consequences. That language, in context, was not posturing for domestic consumption alone. It was a message. Washington read it. And Washington, through back channels that would not be publicly confirmed for days, according to sourcing cited by the Financial Times, communicated something very specific to Beijing. It communicated that the United States was treating the South China Sea barrier as a material change in the strategic environment. It communicated that the Mutual Defense Treaty with the Philippines was not a diplomatic artifact from 1951, but a living commitment with operational implications. And it communicated, this was the detail that made Beijing's foreign policy establishment go quiet for several hours, according to the same sourcing, that the United States had already begun the process of coordinating with Japan, Australia, and South Korea on a joint response framework that would, if Beijing did not demonstrate a credible de-escalatory gesture within a defined window, become a formal multilateral mechanism with permanent institutional architecture. A mechanism, in other words, that would outlast the current crisis. A mechanism that would change the strategic geometry of the region in ways that could not be undone once it was established. This is the detail that defines the current moment more than any other, because China can absorb a carrier strike group repositioning. China can absorb harsh statements from Manila and Tokyo. China can absorb an emergency ASEAN communique. What China cannot easily absorb, and what its long-range strategic planners have always feared, is the consolidation of a formal, institutionalized, American-led security architecture in the Western Pacific that treats China's maritime assertiveness not as a series of isolated provocations to be managed bilaterally, but as a systemic challenge to be countered collectively. That is the architecture that Beijing has spent 30 years trying to prevent. That is the architecture that the South China Sea barrier move may have inadvertently accelerated into existence. The irony is exquisite and terrible. A move designed to project strength and establish irreversible facts on the water may have triggered exactly the international realignment that Beijing's grand strategy was built to avoid. And now, with the carrier strike group repositioned, with Japan and Australia accelerating their own military preparations, with the Philippine Mutual Defense Treaty formally activated, with Taiwan drawing explicit connections between its own security and the South China Sea situation, and with the United States quietly communicating a deadline, a window, a defined moment by which Beijing must show something, the world finds itself standing at the edge of an escalation ladder that nobody fully controls, and nobody is quite sure how to descend. The barrier is still there. The Chinese Navy is still there. The Filipino outpost is still cut off. And in Washington, in Tokyo, in Manila, in Canberra, in the quiet offices where the people who make decisions about war and peace sit with their maps and their intelligence briefings and the weight of what they know, clocks are ticking. Not the theatrical clocks of cable news drama, real clocks, measured in hours, measured in the distance between carrier strike groups and Coast Guard vessels, measured in the silence between one communication and the next, measured in the space between a test of a red line and the moment that test becomes something that cannot be walked back, something the world will spend the next century learning to live with the consequences of. The window is open. The question, the only question that matters now, is whether anyone on either side of this standoff has both the will and the wisdom to close it before history closes it for them.